Hey guys! Today we are going to read through chapter 3 of My Survival, A Girl on Schindler's List, and we're going to look at a new standard skill. Or not new, but for this book that we haven't looked at in a while. We're going to go back to one of our old standard skills, really. Alright, let's do it! Okay, so I'm going to go into our classroom. We go into our classwork and into our drive. And into our Schindler's List folder. And I'm going to go to our week 1 presentation. Okay, so we've read through chapter 1 when we applied the skill of main idea. And we have read through chapter 2 when we applied the skill of text structure. So today is day 3. If you're on track with us in terms of time, then it should be Friday, April 17th. If not, totally okay. You're still on day 3 of this book. And today we're going to read chapter 3, 1939 War. It's a great chapter. We're going to really start to get into our author's story, right? And we are going to apply the standard skill, RI 4.3. All right, let's think about what those letters and numbers mean. R means reading. I means informational text. 4.3, that's our grade level and our standard number. Just a little refresher to make sure that we're all remembering that an informational text is true, right? It's a true text made up of facts. Okay, just want to make sure that we're reviewing that. All right, our I can statement is I can explain connections between ideas and events in historical text. All right. Mirrors on. I can explain connections between ideas and events in a historical text. Mirrors off. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of these words. What's a connection? What does that mean when we talk about a connection? How two things are related, right? That would be a connection between ideas and events. So we know what an event is. It's something that happens. An idea, what does that mean if I'm talking about a connection between two ideas? The word idea is a really vague word. So it can be talking about opinions. It can be talking about perspectives. It can be talking about actual things that happen. Two ideas that someone presents to you, right? Just like I have an idea. Okay, well, we can talk about the connections between that. And then we also have this phrase in a historical text, and we're going to talk about that in a minute too. Think about what that means when a text is historical and what other types of texts we might have. Okay, so we're focusing on finding connections today. That's our third informational standard. So when we talk about connections, there are 3 types of informational texts that we can look at: historical, scientific, and technical. When we look at a historical text, that's a text that tells us about history, about something that happened in the past, right? When we look at a scientific text, that's a text that's going to tell us about something in science. So about a phenomenon in science. That could be something about volcanoes. It could be an experiment. It could be about space. Anything scientific, about the weather. All of those are scientific texts. And then a technical text. We don't see these very often. But as you grow up, you might start to see more of them. A technical text often tells you how to do something. It describes the steps in a process, how to make something, how to follow a recipe or something like that. A technical text gives you a technique kind of to accomplish something. Okay, so I just wanted to review those because those come into play a lot when we find connections, because often we can find the same types of connections within a certain type of text. So let's think for a second, what type of text is Schindler's List? Is it historical, scientific, or technical? Pretty easy. Historical, right? Okay, let's take a look over here at our little anchor chart and talk about what it means to find connections before we go on to that next, this next little question. Okay, finding connections. When we talk about how two things are related or how two things interact, what's the relationship between them, right? If I ask you about an apple and a knife, what's the relationship between those two things? If I ask you about a dog and a curtain, that relationship is a little bit different, right? So, in nonfiction texts, connections and relationships occur between events, people, ideas, pieces of information, or steps in a process, right? So think about that. Which kind of text would we see events? Which kind of texts might we see people? Ideas, pieces of information, probably every text, right? Steps in a process, that would be more scientific or technical. You won't often see steps in a process laid out in a historical text, right? Just like you won't often see events and people. Sorry, kiddos. Events and people in a technical text. That would be atypical, right? So we have all of these different kinds of connections, and these aren't the only types of connections you can make. And it doesn't necessarily matter that you guys can label these connections. Oh, that is this and this. But just that you're able to recognize the connections as we go through. So there's one person and a big event, meaning one person caused a big event to happen, kind of. Or their work led to a big event. And then there's problem and solution. We know what that is. Something went wrong, and then there's a fix for it. There is cause and effect. One thing happens, which causes one or more than one thing to happen. There's part and whole, when you're given a part of something, and then it's added into the whole. That's often seen in technical or scientific texts. There are analogies when something is being compared. Similarities and differences, just like comparing and contrasting, and sequence of events. We're not going to pay as much attention to part, whole, and analogies. Don't worry about those as much. But we definitely want to be able to recognize one person, big event, problem and solution, cause and effect, similar and different, and sequence of events. Okay, so we said that Schindler's List is a historical text. What type of connections might you find within this text? Of these connections listed over here, what types of connections might you find? Person, event, definitely, right? Maybe problem and solution at some point. Definitely cause and effect. Probably won't see similarities and differences. We might. And sequence of events, definitely, right? Those sequence of events are always present in a historical text. So we want to be on the lookout for those. Okay, connections is a very similar skill to structure. But instead of identifying the overall structure and organization of the ideas presented to us, we're asked for how two specific things from the text are connected, how they're related. So instead of asking how does the author organize this information, it'll say the author gave you this information and this information. How are those ideas connected? Does that kind of make sense? Just a little. I, as a teacher, when I was learning my standards, when I saw this standard of connections, I had to go and ask Miss Henry. I was like, wait, this seems just like structure. So it's very similar, and that's okay for you guys to use them to help each other, totally. But instead of asking for an overall organization, it'll ask for how two things are specifically related. Make sense? Okay, chapter 3. What kind of connections can you identify in this chapter? What kind of connections do we see as we go through? And then our quote for today is, where was the rest of the world? So we're really going to get into some of the meat of our author's story. And I have a couple of visuals for you guys. So these are visuals of Krakow. These are pictures taken during the time of Nazi occupation in Krakow. So here we see Nazi officers being stationed around their town, right? And these are Jewish people here. Here's a Jewish person, here's a Jewish person, and we tell because of this white armband. And we'll read about that in a moment. And then this picture I think is really telling. The streets are mostly empty, right? And then there's this Nazi officer right here, and he looks like he's maybe checking some paperwork of these Jewish people. There's like trash piled up in the streets, and these Jewish men have their armbands on, right? So we're gonna take a look at some of the events related to this kind of situation in Krakow. All right. And then we are going to come back to this slide this slideshow, because we do have one more slide that we're going to take a look at after we read chapter 3 and kind of answer that what connections can you identify in this chapter question. Okay? All right. Pull up my big camera. Okay. And we are going to read chapter 3. All right, chapter 3, 1939, War. On September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded Poland. My family was on vacation near Baba Mountain at the time, and when we heard the news on our radio. My father was away on a business trip. He also heard the news on a radio and left his trip early to join us at our summer cottage. We must return to Krakow immediately, he told us. We threw our clothes into suitcases and made our way to the train station, where there were hundreds of people rushing to get home. My family and I managed to squeeze into a crowded compartment, and the train departed for Krakow. A few hours later, we arrived at the Krakow station. The sky was filled with the sounds of air raid sirens and German fighter planes buzzing over the city. We hurried home and ran downstairs with the other tenants to the air raid shelter in the cellar. So an air raid is when an enemy of war has planes going over the city, and the people of the city don't know why those planes are there. So people often will take shelter from an air raid in case they're bombed by those planes. Through the cellar walls, we heard bombs exploding in the distance. The German army was approaching. The bombing finally stopped, and we mounted the stairs to our apartment, terrified about what might happen next. The German army occupied Krakow in the first week of September 1939. They marched through the city in parade fashion, their boots pounding on the pavement, while tanks rolled down the street and shook the ground like an earthquake. Hitler hated Jews. We had known that for some time already. But now his Nazi troops occupied our city, and my father and his brothers gathered in our apartment to discuss what to do. Surely, they agreed, the Germans wouldn't harm women and children. It was the men who were in danger and should run away. Don't worry, they told us. The German invasion won't last long, and soon we will all be together again. My father and his brothers stuffed food and clothes into backpacks, kissed us goodbye, joined other men from our neighborhood on the street, and together they all walked out of the city. I did not know if I would ever see my father again. Weeks went by with no word of whether my father was alive or not. Finally, 2 months after he left Krakow, I was standing outside our apartment building when one of the men from our street came walking home. If this neighbor is back, I told myself, then maybe my father will also come home soon. The next day, he did. My mother and I hugged and kissed him as though he had returned from the grave. The only way we could remain in Krakow and not get deported or killed was if my father succeeded in getting a work permit. We knew we might be killed because the Nazis posted big placards on the streets and newspaper kiosks warning Jews of the consequences of staying without a permit. A permit was a government card that certified the bearer worked at a job Germans needed done, such as construction or business. My father had most recently worked for a pharmaceutical company, going to drugstores to sell goods. But these and other jobs were taken away from Jews, and he became unemployed. So this is almost similar to not similar to what we're going through right now, but right now we have certain essential jobs, right, and non-essential jobs. So some people are able to still work during this quarantine, and other people are not able to because their jobs are not essential. So her father kind of went through something similar where the Jews who were allowed to stay in Krakow had to have a certain type of job that was almost essential, but not just essential to the world, essential specifically to the Germans. One of our apartment superintendent's sons had become the head of the supply company where my father used to work. With this man's help, my father was able to resume his job selling hospital supplies, which qualified him for a work permit. At least for the moment, we were legally allowed to stay in Krakow. Think about the connections from that paragraph. There are lots of them. Think about if there's a cause and effect connection. Think about if there's a sequence connection or a historical connection. Or not a historical connection. It's a historical text, so there will be a historical connection. But think about what specific connections we just saw in that story so far. All right. But that didn't mean we were safe. Life for Jews during the Nazi occupation of Poland grew more dangerous every day. For example, one day, my father bought me a puppy. My mother wasn't so happy about that. She said, if that puppy makes a mess on my floor, you will have to give it away. I had no idea how to train a puppy. Every evening, I took the puppy out for a walk so he wouldn't dirty the floor. By then, the Germans had imposed a curfew, meaning Jews were not allowed to be out on the street past a certain hour. One evening, I took the puppy for a walk later than usual, and 2 German officers walked by and stopped me. "What are you doing out so late?" one of the officers said. I was so scared I could hardly speak. I pointed to my dog. "Go home," the officer yelled, "and don't be out late again." It was so frightening. My parents saw it all from a window of our building. The next day, they gave the puppy away to the woman who delivered the milk to our building. I didn't object. It was a choice between losing my pet or possibly my life. By late 1939, when I was 10 years old, life for Jews in Krakow began growing even worse. It seemed like every day a new law was passed against us. One day, the Germans announced that we could no longer own radios or bicycles. Then they announced that Jews could no longer attend religious services. If we were caught practicing our religion, it would mean immediate deportation or death. After that, we secretly held religious services in our apartment. Sometimes when the adults were upstairs praying, children downstairs in the street watched to make sure that no Germans were coming. If a German officer walked by, The kids on the street signaled to other kids at the second floor window. Those kids ran to tell the adults, and everyone hid their prayer books and prayer shawls. Then the Jews were ordered to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David stitched on it. The Star of David was a symbol of the Jewish people, and because Nazis did not accept Jews as real human beings, the armband was their way of telling everyone, this person is less than human. In December 1939, the German authorities announced that Jewish children could no longer attend school. My classmates and I were still young, and our parents wanted us to continue learning, so they contacted teachers and paid them to give private lessons to me and my Jewish girlfriends. To avoid drawing attention to these illegal classes, we met in a different home each day and hid our books and papers so no one would know what we were doing. Okay, think about, why do you think that the Nazis were taking all of this stuff away from Jews? What good did it do for them to take away school from Jewish children? Why? What was their motivation in doing that? What was the point of doing that? Of taking away their bicycles, of taking away their radios? What was the point of all of this? How was this going to help the Nazis to achieve that goal of the world being perfect and eliminating the Jews from it? How was this going to help them? Next, Jews were no longer allowed to use public transportation. We were forbidden from even walking on the sidewalk and had to walk in the gutter. There was worse to come. The German police threw Jews out of their own shops and gave their businesses to Polish non-Jews. Then they froze our family's bank accounts. With no source of income and no access to our own savings, we had to be careful with whatever cash we had left. Another new law forbade Polish people from doing any business with Jews. This meant that even Jews who had some cash could not buy food in grocery stores. We lived around the corner from a bakery, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would stand in line hoping the baker would agree to sell me a little bread. The only place we could still buy food was the black market, which meant from people who sold food illegally. If caught, we and they would be arrested and beaten, or worse. Across Europe, German armies were conquering one country after another, and rumors filtered back to Krakow that Jews in those countries were being murdered by the tens of thousands. We told ourselves that surely the rest of the world must know what was happening. Surely England would come to our rescue, or perhaps France or America. But where were they? Where was the rest of the world? How much longer would we have to suffer? Could it possibly get any worse? Okay. A rough little chapter there, right? Very sad to see what was happening to her home. All right, I want to look at this slide really fast. So, what kinds of connections could we identify in this chapter? I saw cause and effect connections. I saw problem and solution connections, sequence of events connections, one person, one big event connections, right? That's a big overall connection that we can make for this time period. And then I have a couple of questions for you. Why did her father need a work permit? What problem was solved by giving the puppy away? And what were some effects of Jews wearing a white armband with a Star of David? So those are all questions that ask you to identify connections from that chapter, okay? And those are going to be on your chapter 2 and 3 quiz as well. That'll go up on Google Forms with this video. So you guys can take a look at that too. And our quote, just one more time, where was the rest of the world? Right? So they're going through this national issue in Poland, and they're like, I mean, it's getting worse and worse by the day, and it's completely inhumane. And the government is taking away their radios. They took away school for children. They're making them brand themselves and walk around in shame. They won't let them use the sidewalks. And so our author, Rena, is sitting at home going, well, someone must be hearing about this. The rest of the world must be hearing about this, and they're coming, right? Because where are they? Because this is terrible, and someone has to be realizing how terrible this is and be ready to do something about it for us, be ready to help us, right? All right. That's the end of our first little leg of My Survival, A Girl on Schindler's List. I'll do a little response video for chapters 1 through 3, and there's a chapter 1 quiz and a chapter 2 and 3 quiz that'll be up. All right, kiddos. Love you, miss you, mean it.